I knew something was wrong the moment my mother placed that suit on the dining chair, the way someone might set down an object they no longer cared about but refused to throw away. It wasn't just old fabric, it carried a quiet message I had heard my entire life, one that said I was an afterthought. The sleeves hung lifelessly over the edge of the chair, and for a second, I imagined they were reaching for something they would never touch again. That was exactly how I felt standing there, staring at a future that didn't seem built for me. I remember asking her, trying to keep my voice steady, if it would even fit. She didn't look at me when she answered, just kept folding something in the kitchen as if this conversation didn't deserve her full attention. She said it would cover me, and that was enough. My father stayed glued to his phone, barely acknowledging that I was even in the room. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to help, it was to remind me how lucky I was to have anything at all. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for someone to soften their words, to add something kind, something human, but the silence that followed told me everything. Then my mother said something that settled deep inside me, something that didn't sound angry but felt final. She told me I didn't deserve new things every time life got difficult. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with the suit spread out in front of me, trying to make it work. It had belonged to my sister years ago, back when everything about her was considered an investment. I folded the cuffs inward carefully, as if precision could somehow make it mine. I found a small sewing tin buried in a drawer and used safety pins to tighten the waist from the inside. Each pin felt like a quiet compromise. When I finally tried it on and sat down, one of the pins snapped open and scraped against my skin. I froze for a moment, then decided to leave it. Pain felt easier to carry than asking for help I already knew wouldn't come. The next morning, the city looked brighter than I felt. The company tower stood tall downtown, its glass reflecting the sky so perfectly it almost seemed unreal. I paused outside for a moment, checking my sleeves again and again, trying to convince myself I looked presentable. Every movement felt unnatural, like I was pretending to be someone else and doing a poor job of it. The pants didn't sit right, the shoulders were too wide, and the fabric shifted in ways that made me hyper-aware of every step I took. Walking inside felt like stepping into a world where everything was measured, where people belonged or didn't, and I already knew which category I was in. At the reception desk, the woman handing out visitor badges glanced at my suit for just a fraction of a second before quickly looking away. That tiny moment of recognition felt louder than any insult. I thanked her too quickly, my voice betraying the nervous energy I was trying to hide. The elevator ride was quiet, filled with soft music, and the faint sound of fabric brushing against itself every time I moved. Two other candidates stood beside me, both wearing suits that clearly belonged to them. Everything about them looked effortless. One of them gave me a polite smile, and somehow that made it worse. It wasn't judgment, it was kindness, and I didn't feel like I deserved even that. The conference room was exactly what I had imagined, all glass walls and polished surfaces, overlooking the city like it had nothing to prove. I chose a seat near the corner, hoping to make myself smaller, less noticeable. I kept my portfolio on my lap, using it as a shield to hide the uneven line of the suit where the pins struggled to hold everything together. One by one, candidates were called in for their interviews. Some came back looking confident, others looked like something inside them had shifted. I found myself staring at my reflection in the darkened window, studying the person looking back at me. I didn't look sad, that was the strange part. I looked worn, like parts of me had been used too often without ever being repaired. At 24, I felt older in ways I couldn't explain. When the door opened again, I expected another recruiter. Instead, someone walked in who changed the entire atmosphere of the room without saying a word. I recognized her instantly. She was the kind of person whose name carried weight, someone people studied and quoted. The room adjusted around her presence, everyone sitting a little straighter, paying a little more attention. She greeted the recruiters first, then slowly looked around at the remaining candidates. When her eyes landed on me, they didn't move on, they stayed. I felt it immediately and looked away, unable to hold that kind of attention. She started walking toward the far side of the table, then stopped halfway. She spoke directly to me, her voice calm but certain. I thought I had done something wrong. My mind raced through every possible mistake I could have made in the last few minutes. When I answered, my voice felt smaller than I wanted it to be. She looked at the suit, not in a dismissive way, but in a way that felt like she understood something I hadn't said out loud. Her eyes moved from the shoulders to the cuffs, then to the uneven waistline. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She asked if someone had made me wear it. The room went completely still, I felt heat rise up my neck instantly. My instinct was to dismiss it, to pretend everything was fine, because that's what I had always done. But before I could finish my sentence, she gently interrupted. She said she knew what it looked like, not in a way that felt like pity but recognition. Then, without making a scene, she slipped off her blazer and walked over to me. She held it out like it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know how to respond. Every instinct told me to refuse. But something about the way she stood there made that impossible. She told me I could borrow it, that it would fit better. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. The fabric felt different, structured, intentional. When I put it on, it fit perfectly across my shoulders. It wasn't just about the way it looked. It was about the way it made me feel. For the first time that morning, I wasn't thinking about hiding. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No one clapped, no one said anything inspirational. But something shifted. People started looking at my face instead of scanning my clothes first. It was subtle, but it changed everything. When my interview started, she stayed in the room. The questions were challenging, pushing me to think in ways that felt both exhausting and exhilarating. I answered carefully, focusing on being precise rather than impressive. Then, halfway through, she asked something unexpected. She asked what I did when people decided who I was before I even spoke. I paused for a moment, choosing my words carefully. I knew better than to let emotion take over. I said that I learned to become useful before I became visible. It wasn't something I had practiced saying. It was something I had lived. Something changed in her expression when I said that. It wasn't approval. It felt heavier than that, like she understood the cost behind those words. When the interview ended, I thanked them and stood to leave. As I reached the door, she stopped me. She pointed out my portfolio, and I looked down to realize one of the pins had slipped loose again. Of course, she had noticed, but instead of drawing attention to it, she adjusted the folder slightly so it covered the area. Then she said something quietly, something I didn't fully process until later. She said that none of it was my shame. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and walked out before my composure slipped. 3 days later, I received the offer, not an internship, not a trial position, but a full role. When I told my parents, their reaction was immediate. My mother cried, overwhelmed by the salary more than anything else. My father started introducing me differently, as if I had always been the hardworking one. It should have felt validating, but it didn't. It felt rehearsed, like they were adjusting to a new version of me they hadn't expected. A week into the job, a package arrived at my desk. I opened it slowly, not expecting anything significant. Inside was a blazer tailored perfectly, dark gray and unmistakably mine. There was no long message, no explanation, just a single sentence tucked into the pocket. It said to wear my own size now. I sat there for a long time, holding it in my hands. It wasn't just about the gift, it was about what it represented. For the first time in my life, someone hadn't explained my humiliation or justified it. They had simply corrected it. And in that moment, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe before. Maybe I had never needed to shrink to fit into someone else's version of me. Maybe I had just been waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to remind me that I was allowed to take up space exactly as I was.